What's good, mini crafters? My name is Samuel. I paint minis and I build dioramas. And in today's video, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the best metal painting techniques that you can steal for your own minis. We'll be putting the pedal to the metal using both the TMM and NMM techniques. Plus, I'll be sprinkling in some helpful tips and tricks that hopefully will be helpful to you, so stick around for those golden nuggets. Can't be letting the pun game get rusty. To help with this metallic experiment, I'm enlisting the help of these boner boys since they have a good chunk of metallic pieces all over them, including their armor, swords, and weaponry. I'm going to be painting up each of them in a different approach, namely comparing and showing true metallic and non-metallic techniques. Whoa there, big boy. What are all these fandangled terms that you're throwing around here? Don't let mini painting terms throw you off. Let's start with TMM, or true metallic metal. TMM involves the use of metallic paints to represent metallic surfaces. Most metal paints have a bit of color pigment in the body of the paint, but they also have ultra-fine flecks of metal suspended in them as well, called mica. This is what gives the paint its metallic shine. Typically, the better the quality of paint, the more finely ground those mica flakes are, which makes for a smoother appearance when the paint dries. Now don't worry, we're going to get to NMM, or non-metallic metal, in a moment. But first, let's start with TMM now that we know what it is. And we're going to start with our first skeleton to see what this is going to look like. I'm starting with Pro Acryl Silver, and I'm applying that evenly over the first skeleton's armor. I realize it's a bit hard to see what I've painted here and what I've not, as the silver looks super similar to the Zenithal Prime that I've done. I'm hitting all of the metal armor pieces like the chest, the shoulders, and the shield too. I'm letting that silver dry, and then it's time to start adding shades of color in on top of the silver. Doing this not only helps with creating shadows and highlights, but it's also going to bring some color and interest into play. Unlike with the non-metallic metal technique, you can get pretty good results in relatively quick time using glazes and inks with the TMM technique. This will let the shine of the metallic paint show through. However, if you really want to bump up the contrast, which is what I'm trying to do here, we want to use opaque acrylics to create those strong shadows. Adding non-reflective pigment and shades adds additional contrast. The color that I'm using to create these reflective and non-reflective patterns is a dark blue-gray color. I'm working in thin coats and I'm letting layers dry before coming back in and adding more into the recesses. For the highest points, where we want the bright silver color to show through, we simply don't add any opaque paint right there. For example, the helmet is domed, but it has a flat lower part leading down to the shoulders. I'm leaving the domed part the bright silver, and I'm going to instead add my shade to the flat side part, leading down to the shoulders. The key here is to really think about how the light's going to interact with the various volumes and shapes of whatever miniature you're painting. And then from there you can figure out where you want to put your shades of that opaque paint, or where you want to leave it so that the brightest part is what's not covered. With the armor, a silver color, I decided to switch the metal type up that I'm going to be doing on the shield and the mace. I wanted to go for a more copper brassy look, and to accomplish this, I started with a watered down base coat of Pro Acryl's copper paint. I then thinned down some gold metallic paint and I dotted and stippled that on the upper parts of the shield. This is where the brightest part of the light is hitting the shield, so that's why I focused that color up there. To help with creating contrast and shadows, but also weather the shield, I decided to apply a dark blue wash to the lower part of the shield. This is opposite of the bright yellow that I just put up there with the gold, and this is going to darken the shadows on the lower half of the shield. But it's also going to give me a base coat for adding some verdigris as well. This is going to add some variation to the hues and also bump up the contrast on the shield. I worked the mace the same way that I did for the shield, starting with a copper base coat and then hitting it with a generous wash of the verdigris mixture that I used on the shield. While I'm using a variety of different metallic colors all over this skeleton, I figured that when he died, his shield and his mace were made of the same material. For the chainmail, I again apply a base coat of Pro Acryl's copper, but to give it a brass look and finish, I apply a thin coat of a yellow ink over the top. The ink is a vibrant yellow, but it's also translucent, so that copper base coat shows through, but it also gives a really neat gold look. Remember how we weathered the shield and the mace? Well, we can't forget to weather the armor as well, but instead of a verdigris, we're going to be making some rust weathering. For the rust, I start with a darker brown with a dot of orange mixed in. I focus this first layer in the recesses of the pockmarks and damage all over the armor bits of the skeleton. Then, once that's dry, I add some more of my orange into my mixture and dot that on my previous layer. I'm being sure not to cover the entire last layer, but instead I'm going to be treating this brighter orange color as a highlight of sorts. With the metallic bits done and the weathering wrapped up, I just need to finish this mini up. I chose a turquoise-esque color for this guy's tattered cloak, and I painted the bone up normally. I'm sure if you messed around with whatever color you wanted to for the cloak, it would play a role in how the metallic pieces looked. For example, you could do a really dark black metal and pair that with a red tattered cloak, and I think that would look really good as well. I'll admit I'm a big fan of how fast and easy it was to crank this skelly out. Applying the base coat of silver was easy enough, but when I added the opaque paint on top of that was really when I started to see the look come together. That contrast really sells the metallic look. So that was true metallic metal, or TMM. Easy enough. But you may be curious about non-metallic metal, or NMM. The non-metallic technique is when you're trying to paint something to look metallic without actually using paints with mica flakes in them, like copper or brass or something like that. So instead of just a gold paint that you'd get out of a bottle, you're going to be using browns, yellows, whites, things like that to try to emulate what gold would look like on whatever you're painting. A little trickier. So after doing the first skeleton in TMM, I realized that it was super hard to tell what had been painted or not with my zenithal highlight. So, and maybe it's just my camera, but I decided to base coat the second skeleton in all black to help better show what I'm actually doing here. For painting non-metallic metal, I like to think of it as additive, where I'm slowly adding paint and color to make highlights. And for shadows, I'm simply not adding paint in those areas. Instead, I'm going to let the base color, which is typically a dark desaturated paint, show through. Speaking of desaturated paint, I'm adding an initial layer of Cold Corpse Blue by 2 thin coats. I'm not applying this straight from the bottle though, rather I'm going to be thinning it a bit. I want the black primer to show through, that's how thin this should be. Think of this first layer as you tinting the model rather than trying to get color immediately. I'm going to let that layer dry, and then slowly I'm going to add a dot of some off-white to my mixture. I'm going to be using Wraithbone by GW for this. The goal here is to super gradually lighten the paint layers as you add each of them. And as you apply them, you want to make sure that you are not fully covering your previous layer. Unlike with the TMM technique, you aren't actually really going for a full cover of a metallic paint and then hitting it with some washes and shades. Rather, you're going to be building up texture, painting nicks and scratches, and starting to focus your highlights towards where you want your main light to be on the metal. I think the NMM technique really lends itself to more control and customization where you want your highlights to be built up and where you want your shadows to be. It's a little more artsy. I wish to enact my artistic vision. TMM kind of forces where the lights are and where the shadows are because it's actually reflective. There's real metal in that paint. What you do in NMM is try to emulate that, but you have some flexibility there. That flexibility can look like adding things such as bounce reflections, which is where you see light bouncing off of one metallic thing or surface onto another. You can see me doing some of this here on the side of the skeleton's chest armor. It definitely helps to have this read as metal to a viewer. Once I've gradually built up my layers, I'm saving pure white for the final dots and edges to really punch up that contrast and give it that super shiny appearance. I'm focusing that on the edges of the whole of his chest plate and on top of his helmet, as well as along the edges of his shoulder pad. Personally, I really struggle when it comes from making the jump in highlights and contrast. I'm not very good at making things contrasty. Instead, what I tend to do is keep things muted, which isn't always realistic, because when you look at something that's metallic, you can have super bright highlights directly next to a super dark shadow. Adding the white here may feel too bright, but it's actually really going to go that last step in helping convey the metallic surface on the skeleton's armor. So don't be afraid to up your contrast. For this guy's shield, I want to go with a more gold color, so rather than start with a desaturated blue base coat like I did on the armor plates, I'm opting for a desaturated brown midtone using Vallejo's smoke. Once that's dry, I'm going to be mixing in a bit of Vallejo's Japanese uniform World War II into that smoke base color to create my initial reflection patterns. I'm actually about to add a color that you wouldn't expect, which is green. This is going to help give some color variety to the metal on the shield, and it's going to help me to transition from the desaturated brown base coat up to my brighter, more yellow layers, which I'm about to add. The NMM technique really lends itself to adding different hues. It's not so easy to do that with true metallic, and those different hues, like this green that I'm using, can really increase the visual complexity of the paint job without adding much extra work to you. After the green is mixed in, I'm coming in with some super saturated yellow for the first layer of the highlighted section, and then I'm gradually transitioning that up to a pure white. This is really going to sell the look of this main reflection. Some orange brown is going to also help to add some more variety to my midtones and help with the golden look that I'm after. I don't need much, but it really helps add to the visual interest of the shadowed part of the shield. Just like we did with our TMM skeleton, I'm going to be adding some verdigris to the shield for this NMM skelly as well. The last bit of weathering is to add rust to the armor. However, unlike with the TMM technique, we can't simply add a brown wash, as that would cover the white highlights that we so carefully built up on the armor. That would make it look pretty weird, and honestly it would ruin the look. So I'm going to be taking my brush and I'm going to be very deliberately working it into the pockmarks and recesses of the chainmail as well as the other bits of armor. This needs to dry first, and then I'm going to be coming back and adding a brighter orange to those areas, just like we did with the TMM model. All that's left now is to finish up the mini and the other bits that we haven't painted yet. And that is the NMM version done. It definitely took me a little bit longer and required me to be a bit more thoughtful, but I'd say it turned out pretty great. With both versions done, let's look at and compare the two. I feel that oftentimes people lean towards one or the other technique and don't really try or use the opposite. But like with many aspects of miniature painting, it really comes down to preference, desired outcome, and which you prefer to do. There's no really right or wrong technique to use. For me personally, I feel that the non-metallic metal technique allows me to have some more compositional options, like I mentioned earlier. I have the freedom to add my own interpretations with hues, like the green on the brass shield, and it just feels a little more illustrative to me. But for the true metallic metal technique, I definitely like the realism that comes along with that, and having the ability to adjust the contrast with opaque paint can really help level up that technique, especially if you're looking to do more of that and not just want to apply a base coat and hit it with a wash, which, is totally fine to still do. When comparing both techniques, I would say that TMM is a bit more approachable for newer painters, while NMM initially takes a bit more knowledge of how light interacts with surfaces, where to build shadows, and what color combos you really need to achieve that metallic look that you're looking to convey. I plan to do more NMM in the future to practice the technique. But you may be interested in watching my first foray into TMM when I painted this hydra and I had no idea what I was doing. So if you're new to TMM and you want to see me paint that big chunk up, I'll have the video linked in the upper right hand corner and down in the description below. I often see painters on social media say that the NMM technique is intimidating, which I would agree it is, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. I am by no means a mini painting expert, and I've only done NMM a handful of times, but you need to be patient. You often hear that the first 75% of painting a mini is that mini looking like trash. But it's in that last 25% that you really start to pull all of it together and the mini starts to look great. The only way that you're going to get better at painting or a specific technique is to just jump in and do it. I hope this video was helpful to you, and hopefully you picked up a few neat new tips and tricks for both the TMM technique and the NMM technique. Drop a comment below letting me know what you found most helpful or what you do to be better at one or the other. I really read through those and try to respond to all of them to better cater to my audience and make sure that what I'm making videos about is relevant and helpful and hopefully a little bit funny. Don't forget to like this video, you guys, and be sure to share the video with some hobby nerd friends of yours. It really helps to get this channel out there and continues to help it grow. That's all I have for this one, you guys. Until next time, keep on crafting.